Chapter 12. Settling in and running. "Okay, no, not like that," Rudy shouted over comms. Steve turned and looked toward the Osprey parked 50 meters from them. Rudy was barely visible in the transparent titanium windows of the flight deck. He was gesticulating about something. Corey looked at the half-meter square contraption between her and Steve, then looked over to the ship. "What's the problem?" "If you don't get it set in just the right place, you may not get full coverage," the droid insisted. Corey had her hands on her hips. "It's almost noon, so maybe, we go for mostly covered versus perfectly covered." In the distance, the engines of the searching shuttles whined. Steve looked at her, smiling. Rudy said, Fine. Who needs perfect when humans are involved?" The droid vanished from sight. Steve leaned over and pressed a button on the device between them. A countdown started. He looked at it, then Corey. "We're sure it's pointed the right way?" Corey was already moving toward the end of the module and the ladder there. Over her shoulder, she said, "Little late to worry about that." She vanished over the side of the module. The younger Delfino looked at the device again. He reached down and quickly rotated the device 90 degrees. He backed away, then rushed back. The timer was at 10 seconds. He turned again and ran to the device, turning it back to its original orientation. 5 seconds. He looked at the end of the ore module, then turned and ran to the edge and leapt off. There was a pop, followed by the sound of unspooling wire and ruffling fabric. Steve had bought the devices back on Kelso Station. During the trip out, he had tinkered with them to see how they worked, at least as best as he could without activating one. They contained a compressed gas canister and several dozen meters of memory metal wire. There was also a small power cell and several hundred square meters of fabric that, when charged, absorbed most conventional sensor radiation. The memory metal had been shaped to the specifications of the ore modules, courtesy of schematics provided by Mr. Ichiko. The older man couldn't be certain of the exact model of the modules, but he was fairly certain. The gas propelled the fabric and its wire frame out in all directions. It almost caught up to Steve before he hit the ground and rolled with a not at all dignified grunt. Seconds later, the power cell engaged and the memory metal snapped into shape, wrapping the ore module completely. Steve got back to his feet and said, "See? It was set up correctly." Corey was already following behind Baxter, who was carrying the final device toward the other ore module. "If you could hurry it up a little, that'd be excellent," Skip said. "Those shuttles look like they're working a pattern, and I'm guessing we'll be at the edge of their sensor range in another half hour or so." Baxter, sensor mesh device in hand, leapt to the top of the ore module. As Corey climbed the ladder built into the end, she said, "You think they'll get close enough for visual?" Rudy answered, "Probably not. We've been watching their pattern as best we can with the passive arrays. We're pretty far from the train line, and this valley isn't very big. They're probably assuming that they're looking for freighters." Steve chimed in as he climbed up the module. "Still a good idea to make sure large metallic objects don't show up on their scopes where none should be." "Go, now!" Jax hissed, watching a pair of shock troopers turn and head away from the train toward a small tent that they'd watched officers come and go from for almost an hour. Naomi crawled out from under the car and took off in a running crouch. She covered the distance between the train car and an unattended ground cart quickly. While they waited for an opportunity, they had settled on a plan that both felt had the best chance of them not being captured, arrested, and killed by Imperial forces. Neither thought it was a particularly good plan, but with nothing but their phones and a pistol each between them, it was their best bet. Jax bolted from their hiding spot as soon as Naomi reached the cart. In seconds, she had the cart's systems overridden, and they were moving at what they hoped was a casual-looking pace towards the main administration building. As the cart neared the building, a garage door automatically opened. Jax drove into the garage and parked the cart next to a half-dozen similar carts. There was no one in the garage. By their best guess, the morning shift had already started, and the night shift looked to have been kept on to help with the train heist investigation. "Let's find the locker room." He headed toward the personnel door, Naomi in tow. She placed her hand on the access card reader. Her blue tattoos lit up from fingertip to elbow, then faded as the small light on the device turned green, and the door slid open. The administration building was 2 stories, almost entirely empty. Occasionally they heard voices, usually near staircases up to the 2nd floor, likely where managers were overseeing things from. Jax and Naomi split up to raid the men's and women's locker rooms. After a rushed shower and a few looted lockers, Jax walked out of the men's locker room. "Orange is your color," Naomi said, as she joined Jax in the anteroom outside the 2 locker rooms. Both were in bright orange jumpsuits with reflective strips on the arms and legs. Jax did a slow spin. She looked around, ignoring him. "What now?" Jax shrugged. "Well, I'm hoping we can walk right out the front gate." He checked his G-phone. "Breakfast?" Naomi nodded. Therapy or something. The last of the camouflage nets deployed with the pop-hiss of the compressed air, driving the memory metal and smart fabric over the bundled ore modules. Corey and Steve, standing on either side of Baxter, smiled. Corey wiped her brow. She had pulled her hair back into a single puff near the back of her head. "How is it so muddy here if it gets this warm?" Steve looked around. "Beats me. Let's head in. The ship has AC. He put a hand to his stomach. "And I'm starving." Baxter was following behind them. "I'll patrol out here. Make sure no one stumbles onto our little hiding place." Both humans nodded. The stoic combat droid loped off on a course away from the Osprey. As they entered the cargo and continued up the staircase, Corey said, "So, what's the deal? You 2 get your shit worked out?" Steve blushed. "Not really something I want to discuss with my brother's girlfriend." "Prude." She chuckled as she started rifling through the cupboards and pantry, looking for lunch fixings. "When we get back to Kelso, I'm gone. Marshall is fun and all, but it's not a long-term thing. You and Jax are both adults. No one is judging your choices." Steve dropped into one of the chairs at the small dining table. He cleared his throat, then did it twice more. "It's not that, well, maybe." He looked at the ceiling. "This is kinda new to me." Corey turned. "What? Dating? Sex?" She smiled so widely that Steve leaned back. "You're not a virgin, are you?" She chuckled. "Well, I guess I know the answer to that one." Steve shook his head. "No, but would that be so bad?" Corey held up both hands, palms out. "No, not at all." She turned back to the frying pan she'd started heating. She grabbed 2 eggs, cracking them as she spoke. "Nothing wrong with saving yourself. Sorry I laughed. You okay with breakfast for lunch?" "Like I said, not a virgin, at least not like that. Jax is, well..." He trailed off, looking at his feet. Corey put a few strips of bacon next to the sizzling eggs, then looked at the younger Delfino brother. "Oh, I see." She walked over and put her hand on his shoulder. "You know there's nothing wrong, right?" She looked over her shoulder and rushed back to flip the bacon and the eggs. "I mean, we like what we like, and that can and does change over time. Nothing to be ashamed of." She turned. "If your brother has an issue, I'll make sure he's squared away before I head home." Steve looked up. "Yeah, I know, but, well, it's new." He watched her shuffle the bacon around. "Jax is a good guy, despite being a jerk to Marsh and me almost his entire life, growing up." He was silent a moment. "And no, despite that, Marsh isn't a problem. He's never been anything but open-minded and supportive." "I seem to recall you Delfinos doing your part in that little rivalry thing with Jax," Corey quipped, sliding the eggs onto a plate. The bacon was still sizzling and spitting. "You guys were pretty mean to him when his parents died." "Well, we were kids," Steve said as he stood and took the plate of eggs from Corey, putting it on the table. He moved to the refrigerator, looking inside. "Milk okay?" "Gross. Why does he have skim milk?" He left the jug in the fridge and poured 2 glasses of water. Corey slid the bacon onto another plate and sat down at the small table. As she redistributed the eggs and bacon across the 2 plates, she said, "So, if it's not what others think that's bothering you, what is it? I can tell you, Jax is a pretty okay boyfriend." Steve took a bite of bacon. After swallowing, he said, That's not exactly a great endorsement." Corey shrugged. "Men are dumb. 1, maybe 2 in 100 of you make good boyfriends or husbands. The rest are really just there for entertainment." She winked. "I guess I just don't know what I want." He took a few bites of eggs. "These are good." She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "That fight we had when he came to Marsh and me about this?" He waved his free hand around to take in the osprey. "We'd gone out a few times, nothing serious, I thought. I was seeing a girl from station engineering. We had broken up rather spectacularly." He paused, weighing how much he wanted to share. "I was drowning my sorrows in Wendy's, and Jax was down there closing a deal or something. We got to talking, and one thing led to—" Corey held up a hand. "I don't need details." Steve made a face. "I wasn't going to give you any. Anyway, a few days later, Daisy and I patched things up. At least that's what I thought then. I told Jax. He thought I'd slept with him as a spite move or rebound or something. I got mad and accused him of seducing and taking advantage of me." He trailed off, then added, "And I slugged him." He took a sip of his water. "Anyway, that was the last we talked until the dart tournament at the Angry Spacer." "Yikes," Corey said, between bites of egg. "Well, you know I like Jax, even having dated him for a while. But if you're thinking of exploring this aspect of your life, he's not the one I'd pick as a guide. You deserve better." "Tell me about it. Seems like he'll sleep with anyone." He smiled as he ate a piece of bacon. "He's not what I'd call choosy. No," Corey agreed. Eggs and bacon. They were walking with a group of night shift stockyard workers who were heading home, or to a bar. They'd barely gotten out of the admin building before hundreds of workers flooded into it as their shift finally ended, hours later than normal thanks to the train robbery. They watched from behind a heavy lift ground transport as the night shift clocked out and headed for the gate to the stockyard, falling in towards the end of the group. The exit to the yard was only 100 meters away. A small turnstile was all that separated Jax and Naomi from the relative freedom of Salma proper. Jax figured the employees clocked in and out at the admin building, and since Jebediah was squarely in the nowhere part of the empire, security wasn't strict on who came or went into the stockyard itself. That might change after today, but that wasn't Jax's concern. A man stood in line in front of them, a heavyset man of Earth-African descent, or maybe directly from Africa on Earth, given the open immigration policy currently in place for Jebediah. He looked over his shoulder. "You get stuck playing detective too?" The man pushed through the turnstile. Jax looked at Naomi, then the man. "Yeah, had us inspecting up and down the line. I probably clocked 6 kilometers just walking along the train." "Tell me about it," the man agreed. "I'm gonna have to soak my feet before I go to bed. Stupid assholes." He grunted. "Who robs mom and pop co-ops just trying to get by?" Before Jax could reply, the worker waved and picked up his pace. "Damn, that's my bus." He trotted toward a bus that had pulled up outside the gate. "Hey, wait up!" he shouted. Jax pushed through the turnstile and watched the man vanish onto the bus. He looked around and saw Naomi exiting the stockyard. "Where to?" she asked. He removed his G-phone from a pocket and scrolled through a few screens. He looked up, pointed down a street leading away from the stockyard. Popular place up the street." He set off. She fell in next to him. "I hope they have bacon," Naomi said, as they approached Benny's Diner. Jax reached for the door, holding it open as Naomi entered. He looked around. Not very busy, but that was to be expected. It was still an hour or two before the lunch rush would likely happen, and the day shift crew was already at work. A tall, thin woman with gray hair held in a tight bun atop her head looked up from the countertop she was wiping down. "Hi, folks, take a seat wherever you like. I'll be right over." Naomi smiled as she took in the scene. "Cute place. This planet just moved up a notch." Jax slid into a booth. "Oh, from what, the bottom of the scale?" "More or less." The older woman arrived with a pot of coffee and 2 cups. The cups were a brown ceramic, polished to a high sheen. She set the cups down and filled them. "Have a chance to look at the menu?" Naomi shook her head. "No, but if you've got bacon and eggs, I'm good." The woman smiled. "I have just the thing." She looked at Jax. "Sweetie." Jax tapped his chin as he thought. "I'll have the same. But can I get hash browns?" "Of course." She turned and left. Naomi picked up her cup and took a sip. "This place is like one of your old-timey vids." She examined the cup. "Think they make these with the mud here?" Jax took a sip of his coffee, then looked at the mug. "Might be where the coffee comes from, too." He took another sip, then reached for the sugar. He said, "So, after this, we gotta get back out to the ship. Thoughts?" Naomi looked around, then settled on a small display set into the table near the wall. It was displaying an ad for some type of medical device to help with miner's toe, whatever that was. She reached out and set her hand on the device. The screen immediately went blank before lines of computer code started scrolling. The now familiar blue lines began glowing along her arms and up her neck to encircle her right eye. Jax looked around nervously, but saw only the waitress back behind the counter cleaning more of the brown coffee mugs. He tried to look as casual as he could, sipping his coffee, as Naomi remained motionless, pulses of blue light moving up and down her tattoos. He was taking another sip when she inhaled sharply, her hand jerking away from the device. Jax nearly spat out his coffee. The ad for the medical device resumed playing. Pet names. "I think this might be their closest pass," Skip said from the ceiling. Corey and Steve were on the small bridge watching on the various displays as one of the shuttles launched from Selma made its way towards them. The number of shuttles searching the surrounding countryside had changed several times during the night and morning hours. Right now, there were only 2. One was on a course that Skip projected would bring it within 15 kilometers of their position. The Osprey, being designed to sneak behind enemy lines to snoop, deliver goods or troops, or in some scenarios, attack, was not at much risk. Her active camouflage and sensor masking tech were good. The 2 sets of stolen ore modules, on the other hand, were another thing entirely. Steve was as confident as he could be in the camouflage rigs they'd purchased to hide the massive cargo modules. But one glitch in their wiring or failure entirely, and the passing shuttle would likely see them. The younger of the Delfino brothers watched the screens intently. "Any indications of malfunctions from the ore modules?" he asked out loud. "None," Rudy answered from his station. The small navigation droid was monitoring the functions of the camouflage modules remotely. So far, both were active and showing no fault codes. Corey watched out the transparent titanium window. As a small dot moved into view, grew larger but not a lot, then continued on. Skip said, "I think we're in the clear." Corey released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Steve turned to head to the staircase and the common deck 1 level down. "Okay, that's good then." He consulted his G-phone. "Looks like about 7 more hours before pickup." As he pocketed his phone, he said, "Hey, rollerball. Jax have a dartboard?" "Or darts?" Corey added. The rust-colored nav droid disengaged from his console. His squat cylinder head spun. "I think so, maybe. I'll go look." Steve nodded and headed down the stairs. Rudy zipped to the open center of the staircase and dropped. Corey stood to follow Steve and Rudy when Skip said, "Corey, do you think he's okay?" She looked up at the ceiling. "Jax? Yeah, of course. Why?" There was a pause as the SI that ran the ship thought about it. Finally, it said, "Naomi is a new variable that I have been unable to quantify." Corey smiled. "Yeah, she's definitely a variable, but I think she'll keep him safe." She rested a hand on the bulkhead. Plus, when has Jackson Caruso ever not scraped by in a dangerous situation? "Good point," the SI conceded, sounding reassured to Corey's untrained ear. She headed down to the common deck. "So," Jax motioned to the terminal and its ad for some type of knee brace. "Success?" Naomi shook her head. "Afraid not." She tilted her head towards the terminal device, now displaying an ad for a treatment for upset stomachs. Was everyone on this planet sick from one thing or another? "Those things aren't on the planetary network. There's a server somewhere on site that serves up the ads." Jax nodded. "Great," he agreed. He took a bite of his hash browns. "Good." He took a few more bites. He raised a hand to flag down the waitress. Naomi looked over her shoulder to see the older woman approaching. When the woman arrived, she said, "Need something?" Jack smiled. "Just a question. We're thinking of getting away for the day. We just got here, though not super familiar with the city." The woman looked from Jax to Naomi, a twinkle in her eye. "The flats to the east are popular with young lovers," she winked. "So I hear. You can rent a skimmer at Hasim's." She held her hand out, fingers wiggling. When Jax just stared at her, she said, "Phone?" "Ah." He handed his G-phone over. The waitress tapped on the screen a moment, then swiped a few times. She handed the device back. He looked at his phone and nodded. "Thanks." He turned to Naomi. "Love bug. It's not a long walk to Hasim's." The face Naomi made was one Jax wished he could capture on his phone and attach to Naomi's contact info. She growled but recovered, smiling. "That's good news, flat butt." The waitress watched the exchange, eyebrows crawling to the top of her forehead. She didn't say anything as she turned and left. One more thing. "Steve, Corey, I think we might have an issue," Skip said over their earpieces. Steve and Corey had set up Jax's old dartboard, a relic from their first few years out of school. That was before Corey and Jax ended their relationship, when hustling visitors to Kelso at darts kept them in beer and food. Corey threw her last dart, then said, "Oh?" Steve added, "Wouldn't that be an additional issue? It's not like we don't have a few ongoing concerns right now." There was what sounded like a sigh on the other end of the line, before Skip said, "Okay, fine. We have an additional issue to worry about." When it was clear the SI would not elaborate on his own, Corey pressed, "Which is?" "An Imperial ship just made orbit.
What? Have they detected us?"
Steve interrupted as he grabbed the darts and dartboard. Skip very clearly sighed this time.
"Not that I can tell. I'm still running passives, and our stealth systems are still fully engaged. I don't think it's one of the big ones. A cutter or system patrol boat would be my guess. That said, though, getting out of here may be a bit trickier."
Steve released the breath he had been holding.
Okay. Well, I guess monitor it."
"You think? I sure am glad you're here. I wouldn't have known what to do otherwise,"
the SI replied, then closed the channel. Steve grimaced as he looked at Corey.
How does he put up with that? Are all droids this mouthy?
She tightened the fabric strip that was keeping her hair back and said, "There are plenty of droids on Kelso." Steve shrugged.
"Marshall isn't a fan, so we don't interact with him much."
He put the dartboard back and handed her the darts. The waitress came over.
"Anything else?"
Jax shook his head. "No, we're done." The woman nodded and held her tablet up. She tapped a few times, then swiped towards Jax. His G-phone buzzed, and he acknowledged the bill and added a generous tip. The older woman smiled when she saw the tip.
You get some overtime?
When Jax didn't answer immediately, she pointed to his bright orange outfit, then Naomi's.
Work in the yard, right? Skimmer rental. Big tip. Not exactly normal for yardies, she smiled.
Ah, yeah, sorry, Jax replied.
Long night,
Naomi added.
I heard, the woman said. Got the whole garrison up in arms, troopers stomping all around. Who robs little operators like that?
Jax and Naomi exchanged a glance. He said, what do you mean? Naomi added,
That's the second time someone mentioned that. Didn't they tell you? The scuttlebutt is that the modules that got lifted were from a handful of small mom-and-pop mining operations out of Abda, she tutted. Damn shame.
Jax's cheeks started to burn. He could feel the flush creeping up. We, hadn't heard. So, you mean those lots weren't one of the larger mining corps? Again, the older woman shook her head.
Not according to the rumor mill. All small operations. I'm guessing many will have to fold, sell their plots and equipment to try to recoup some of their investment, she sighed. Tale as old as time. Come out to the frontier, strike it rich. Except you're just as likely to fall victim to criminals or other settlers.
Criminals? Naomi asked. The woman looked around. The diner was almost entirely empty now. The women who'd come earlier were at the opposite end, engrossed in whatever conversation they were having.
Crimson Orchid has been trying to get a leg up on the mining trade here.
Crimson Orchid? Jax asked.
Some new syndicate, based on Themura, I hear.
At that, both Jax and Naomi looked at each other, realization dawning on them.
Sounds like they're trying to buy up the smaller plots to get a majority on the mining board.
Jax sighed. Because the board sets the prices and the trade routes. The waitress nodded. She looked over to the two women again as one waved politely. She nodded and turned to Jax and Naomi.
You two enjoy your romantic getaway. I'm sure the hubbub will be settled in a day or two.
Naomi smiled.
Yeah, probably.
When the waitress was out of earshot, Jax looked Naomi in the eyes.
Well, shit.
Understatement of the year, she agreed.